So what I'd like to do today is to do the first of two advanced lectures, which probably to you will feel more like talks you're attending. Today, I'd like to talk about a parametric analysis versus non-parametric analysis and some advanced topics in the context of thresholding. And then next time, so next Wednesday, I will have a lesson up on preprocessing specific for resting state analysis. So here's the outline for today. I'd just like to start with a broad introduction as to why do we do parametric analysis, or why might we want to do non-parametric analysis. And then really the lecture will be divided in two parts. The first and sort of a fairly short part will be discussing the use and the advantages of using a non-parametric analysis for ROI type analysis. And I'll give you some examples of when parametric analysis have gone wrong in the context of ROI analysis. And then the bulk of this talk will actually be on group analysis. So we'll discuss the assumptions that are typically underlying the parametric approach to group analysis. And we'll discuss the main violations that we notice, which tend to be normality and outliers. And as part of this, I'll also focus on the specific assumptions of corrections for multiplicity that we have seen, and how these interact with sort of with our inferences and with the discussion of parametric versus non-parametric approaches. And then I'll just close with sort of what I've called food for thought with respect to how are you going to choose your next thresholding in the next paper you're going to write. So first, why are our analyses for the most part parametric? Well, there's a number of excellent reasons. For one, it's just the most efficient way of doing things. You get optimal power, defined as the probability of detecting a difference when one is present, so long as the assumptions of the model are met. And this, of course, is all the more important in neuroimaging if you think that overall we tend to have pretty low signal-to-noise ratio. We tend to have low degrees of freedom, at least in terms of group analysis, where degrees of freedom come from the number of participants we can include in a group analysis, as opposed to the first level analysis, where we tend to have much better degrees of freedom because their degrees of freedom come from the number of volumes, which at this point can be in the several hundreds range. And then, of course, it's also all the more important if you think that what we're doing is the so-called standard massive univariate approach, where we do one analysis per voxel, and then we have to adjust for multiplicity. So we have to adjust for multiple comparison, which further hurts our sensitivity. Second, of course, computationally, it's just much simpler to do a standard t-test type approach, a parametric approach, as opposed to a non-parametric approach, which typically will require some sort of resampling or subsampling or something of that sort. All the more when you have to do that on 100,000 or more voxels at a time. Third, of course, the parametric approach is a very nice, flexible approach that allows you to test multiple factors at the same time, to have multiple contrasts in there, to factor in the influence of covariates. If you think of the GLM approach, and these are not exactly as simple, although now they are doable, but they're not as simple when you do a non-parametric type approach, particularly in the context of permutations. So that's sort of another reason why parametric analysis make great sense. And finally, honestly, parametric analysis fail pretty gracefully, meaning when things go wrong, typically things get more conservative at the level of one sample t-test. It'll turn out that once you start digging and you also look and you add into the equation, you factor in multiple comparisons, then the problem becomes the reverse. But in general, parametric analysis tend to fail gracefully, at least if you're doing something as simple as a one-sample t-test. If you're going to more complex things, like regressions and correlations, then it's unclear that it fails as gracefully. So the problem with parametric analysis is that obviously they come with a number of assumptions concerning the distribution of data, which are not always met. In the context of our analysis in particular, these assumptions become fairly problematic. Now, the assumptions being that of identical distribution, and the problem that comes out of this is that outliers can exert great pull on your means of the data. And so even in large samples, you can actually get some pretty strong effects from one or two outliers. And so you have to handle outliers somehow. And this will apply to both ROI and group analysis. The other I of IID is the independence. And here the problem is that you end up with just very liberal p-values, which means you get an inflated alpha, and the actual degrees of freedom that you have turns out to be less than the nominal ones that you think you have. Then violation of normality, or rather normality is another assumption which often gets violated, and the problem here is that it's just not easy to tell how exactly this is affecting p-values and error rates. And finally, equal variances or homoscedasticity. The problem here is that when that is violated and you end up with heteroscedasticity, then you end up having p-values that are again too liberal, which means you have a high rate of false positives, more than nominal, and you end up with having less degrees of freedom than you think you have.